All right, Todd, man, thank you for making time to be on the Intentional Agribusiness Leader podcast. I'm super excited to dive into that brain of yours today and see what you can share with us as it pertains to being intentional about leading agriculture in a time when there's a lot of variables influencing how we make decisions. So I think this is going to be fascinating. I want to get us kicked off with the opening question that everybody gets, though. What does it mean to you to be intentional?
Yeah, when I hear intentional or intentional leadership, I think that the first thing that pops into my mind is about being, mindful and present, and really being deliberate about your actions. But I think in a bigger picture context, I think it's really about having a firmer, stronger connection between your big picture purpose and mission and what you're doing with your time on a day-to-day basis. I think that's what really resonates with me is this, I feel like I'm striving to have a more firm, more concrete connection between my big picture purpose and what I'm doing with my time on an hour by hour or even a minute by minute basis. And so I get up every morning and try to really focus on how can I spend more of my time today connecting with and serving the bigger picture purpose. And so it's really about taking a kind of a sometimes a bigger picture, longer term concept and making it real on a day-to-day basis. And so,
Mhm.
that's really what resonates with me and kind of what I try to focus on in terms of
Yeah.
being intentional.
I really enjoy that because one of the reasons that I've even created this podcast is to provide a conversation or a set of conversations, some resources and an experience for leaders to pay attention to the fact that sometimes we get a little bit myopic in our approach and we're just looking to solve the thing that we got to react to today. Most of the time, when we're getting called in to work with organizations on maybe solving some sort of employee related issues, or turnover's too high, or sales team's not performing, or whatever the variable is, often that's in reaction to something that's happening now.
Right.
Rarely is it, hey, help us build a team because we see something amazing or an amazing opportunity or something really dramatic happening in the market about 5 to 10 years out. We got to get ready now. I've never had that conversation with anybody ever in a sales conversation. And you're somebody who has a unique seat because of the nature of the consulting work that you do, especially overseas. You're working a lot in China, in Asia. You've been in Latin America. With Swine Insights and in other roles. So talk to us a little bit about, what do organizations need to be thinking about around developing talent for the future in from, just from the 30,000 foot view that you get these days.
Yeah, so I think I have a sort of a dual perspective on this. I mean, internally here, we're a very small team, and we are trying to build a culture around entrepreneurialism, really. And I'm trying to, my vision there is to bring together a bunch of people that are entrepreneurial minded, that have complementary skills, and try to create an ecosystem where they can work together to create value for clients, and
Mm-hmm.
not in a compulsory sort of way, but really in a way where, hey, you come together and we think you've got something to contribute along with everybody else on the team, but you're remain free to go pursue other interests as well, right? So
Mm-hmm.
it's definitely a non-traditional model in terms of, not necessarily bringing on employees, but really bringing on people on a contract basis, and it allows us to attract a different kind of person. And I think it allows us to create a dynamic that everybody benefits from. Me, our other teammates on the Swine Insights team, and then more importantly, ultimately our clients that we interact with. And so I think that's an example. It may not be practical in every implementation for people to do that, but I think it's an example of kind of the creativity that we need to be developing around addressing this issue. I mean, no matter where
Mm-hmm.
I'm working with clients, and that's the other piece, and it's a lot more traditional. This is an issue that I work with my consulting clients on a daily basis. And
Yeah.
the two issues that come up everywhere I go in the world are animal health and labor.
Yeah.
And they're slightly different concerns around labor. In some places it's, we can't find quality labor, and in some places we can't afford the labor, and there's some different issues, but it's on the top 3 list of virtually every client
Yeah.
that I have around the world. And so I think the big message that I'm trying to pass along to the industry is I think we're really at an inflection point here as it comes to labor. And I think we've got to get a lot more creative than we have in the past. And, doing more of what we've done to get ourselves here, I just don't think it's going to cut it moving forward. And so I think we've got to get a lot more creative about tapping into non-traditional sources of talent, whether that's high school graduates or whether that's, semi-retired people that still have something to contribute, or, whether that's, really engaging in a different way with the immigrant community. And in some of these countries like the U.S., I mean, I really think there's a ton of opportunity to get very creative and really, start thinking about things in a different way. And to kind of use a cliche, I think we've really got to get outside the box on that. And really, in addition to that, I think it's also about focusing on, not necessarily focusing on the people as much as focusing on the job, right? I've talked to a client, had a really frank conversation with a client in China a few weeks ago, and I said, he complained about not being able to find people to work, and I said, well, maybe it's not a great job, right? Maybe it's just not a nice, situation, and they've had the luxury in the past of having, huge volumes of, relatively cheap labor. And I'm a proponent of the idea that cheap labor is a myth, but it does drive behavior on both the employee and the employer side. And I was basically trying to convince him to, rethink the opportunity, right? How can we make this job more attractive to the people instead of having, trying to find people that are willing to do this job? Maybe we need to try to make this job more attractive to the people. And I looked around the room, and there's a couple of young people, that had college degrees. And, I looked at them and said, would you want to do this job? And they were like, no, I wouldn't want to do it. Well, no, it's not a great job. How do we make this a better job? And those are, it's an easy thing to say and a hard thing to do, but I really think we've got to get a lot more creative and really step outside of our comfort zone and start trying to think about how we can formulate opportunities for people that are attractive to the next generation.
Yeah. Well, and this just sort of popped into my mind, and it's relevant because it just happened the other day. I was at the hardware store with my son, and as we're throwing in a couple bags of soil and some light bulbs and, various things we had to pick up from Lowe's, we're a couple of young Mormon gentlemen came up, with their, we're in North Carolina. It was 95 degrees with 105-degree heat index. They got black slacks, white t-shirt, white long sleeve white shirts with a tie on and their little name tag, and elder so-and-so, elder so-and-so. And I'm not going to debate anybody on the whole religious aspect. That's not the point of this story. That's a tough job. Right. That's a tough job. And in that church, in the first, 2 years, 18 and 19 or 19 and 20, whatever the time frame is for members of that church, first 2 years out of high school, they go and serve the Lord, right? Serve their church to spread the word, and try to expand their church. And so it's fascinating to me, right? Like that, a lot of people don't want to have that conversation. A lot of people will not be as understanding as I am because I have a lot of friends who are Mormon. So I've had the conversation with them and I'm not, but I respect the heck out of what these people have to go and do. Right. Yep. That's a tough job. An interesting idea. And this is I'm just playing off of what you're saying is, hey, maybe there's a mission, right, for young people to get involved in the food industry, right? Yep. In the animal production industry. Like this is a place where we need people similar to like if you grew up in Israel, right? And everybody gets to go do a 2-year stint in the military, and they look how loyal, these people are. Look at some of the problems that eliminates. I actually was at an event. We ran an event a couple weeks ago. And I said, if every young person in America, especially every young man, every 13-year-old in America had to go hunting and shoot a deer and see what it looks like, right? The school shooting stuff, all these other like atrocities that we see, that's going to go away. right? If we get young people engaged in something early. And so I'm riffing just a little bit. This is not by no means my campaign platform, but I'm just looking, as you're talking about thinking outside the box, like, hey, how could we redefine the opportunity? Right. Hey, this is, yeah, for 2 years, you get to go do something, or maybe for 6 months, you get to go do something, and you can rotate people in through, but that would be better than some of the, I mean, I know, pork operations, certain locations in Oklahoma and different places that have 400, 500, 600% turnover. It's just a revolving door, right, of people coming through. So anyway, are you seeing the same thing no matter where you go? Is it a labor challenge? I mean, they're not getting a better deal in China because there's cheaper labor, or other parts of Southeast Asia or Mexico. Or, I mean, you're seeing the same things.
Yeah, I've seen really similar trends, and I think they're in different phases of it, but it's a challenge everywhere we go, and that whole idea of having a unlimited supply of willing labor is just really not true almost anywhere. I mean, probably the only place that it might still somewhat be true is in Africa, and we've done a few new projects in Africa. I'm super interested in Africa and been trying to get engaged there for a while. It's a complicated place, and I think we finally found a couple of opportunities to do that. So I made a couple of trips over there, and there it's not so much about labor availability; it's about finding quality people that have the training and the mindset that you need in order to be successful. So it's definitely different in different places, but there's a lot. I mean, it's a lot more similar in China right now to the U.S. than what most people realize. Their labor costs have gone up dramatically, and productivity hasn't really gone up with it. And so, they're trying to make, China's always a challenge because things always happen 10 times faster there. And so they've got like 25 years worth of consolidation that's happened in like 4 years, right? And so, trying to keep up with that. And like I told a client in China a couple of weeks ago, I said, look, industries can change really fast, but people change much slower, right? And so all the people related stuff is a whole lot bigger challenge because everything else is moving at a pace that just, people change, can't really keep up with.
Yeah. Wow. Well, so we definitely see, that's both a near term and probably long term issue facing pork production and other livestock aspects of the industry. I'm curious, just as I think about all of the other aspects of the industry that ultimately a lot of the corn and soybeans go through the livestock production, or are raised to serve livestock production. And there's a lot of companies that serve those industries, and we're all tied together, right? There's no way that it all leans in on each other ultimately. So, as if I'm a leader of one of these companies, any company in ag, and I want to be intentional about taking care of my people, leading my business, having the right insights, what are you seeing? Give us a glimpse. 10 years out to 15 years out. Because I think this is important to me. Part of being intentional is taking time to work on yourself and work on your business, as opposed to just being reactionary. And we live in this reactionary world you and I talked about before we hit record, right? Where we're reacting to the next 12 months. But what about 60 months out, or what about 120 months out, right? We're looking down the road. So if I want to be intentional about leading that company into the next 5, 10, 15 years, what insights can you share with us that we should be thinking about?
I think you need to have a mechanism, a process for thinking about the future in a systematic way. I've done quite a bit of training around strategic foresight, and I think that framework offers a pretty compelling way to approach that longer term thinking. And like we talked about before we started recording, in the agriculture industry, we're really good at living in the moment, and we're really good at that next 12 months, right? In those kind of that window of time where we're, looking at futures markets, and when we're looking at, weather patterns and stuff like that, that's a type of futures thinking that we're very comfortable with. And so you have, very often agriculture organizations are quite good at planning for the next 12 to maybe 18 months. And then fewer, but still quite a few, have a pretty decent 3 to 5 year business plan. and I think what we really need to do is stretch that horizon out pretty significantly. Not quit doing what you're doing now. I mean, it's adding to that. But I think what you can't do is just take those same procedures, the same processes that you use for that shorter or medium term business planning and translate that to long term business planning. And long term business planning is more about, not trying to predict what's going to happen, but trying to imagine scenarios that are at least plausible. And then entertaining a wide variety of those scenarios, and then start trying to identify trends and start trying to identify those things that keep coming up repeatedly, in even different scenarios, and start identifying those capabilities that as an organization you can begin developing that are very likely to be able to be more valuable 10 years from now or 15 years from now than they are today, right? And so it gives you a lot of flexibility in being able to do those over long periods of time, and doesn't require really all that much effort. It's just about spending a little bit of time living in the future in a productive way. And so I think a big part of that is trying to develop that framework. I think strategic foresight offers, a flexible and reasonable framework to kind of do that that is both realistic and has real application value. As it relates to labor, I think we need to be really thinking about, where are we going to be at in terms of technology, and, what kind of jobs are we going to need to be hiring for. Labor is a major limitation across agriculture. It's certainly an issue in our industry, but, in specialty crops, it's a major problem. One of the things that when I talk to people that are advocating for vegetarianism or veganism, I tell them, look, there's not enough non-animal based material out there to feed the planet. And even if there was, there's certainly not enough people to harvest it, right?
Yeah.
And so, that's a real limitation. I mean, it's the major limitation to meat processing in North America. It's the major limitation to expanding pretty much any part of agriculture at this point. So I think getting creative around that and trying to figure out what does that look like, and trying to craft a opportunity from the employee back, and really thinking kind of reverse engineering these roles, trying to figure out how can we make that more attractive to the kind of people that we want to attract, I think is going to be critical.
Yeah. Yeah. And it's such a fascinatingly complex issue when you think about working the problem backwards from the employee level, and then overlaying what some of this strategic foresight might tell us, about the future. And it's such a fascinating place. And I think that's one of the things that makes being intentional so challenging, is that it really does take work. Right? It does take investment. It does take time. And this is where I think a lot of people it's why we punt so many of our big issues down to the next generation. Mm-hmm. Right. Yep. And we just keep punting and punting. But I mean, as when I think about the law of exponentials, like we can punt and punt and punt, but eventually this thing will eventually take off and get to a point where, things can become unsustainable, so it's so necessary.
If you look out through human history, I mean, we have historically been a species that's very good at adapting and very poor at long-term planning, right? Especially for things that we can't see, that we can't, that aren't tangible. So you think about, climate change, you think about, all these different things that we've done kind of a poor job of thinking about in the future. And I think, part of that is trying to understand, the most valuable 21st century skill is going to be, being able to get out into the future and think in the future in a productive way. And it's not something that comes naturally to us. We're not, we talk about all these different things where we've evolved to be a species that it's not really good at some of the things that are becoming a lot more important, right?
Yeah.
And so we've got to get better at that, and being able to find a framework for being able to get out into the future and think about the future in a productive, systematic way, and being able to let go of the idea that we're going to predict what's going to happen 10 years from now, because that's silly and it's probably not very productive. But there is a way that you can, invest time to think about the future in a productive way that will allow you to identify some of those skills that either you personally or organizationally are going to need to develop to thrive in these different environments. I mean, one of the things that I find very often when I work through these strategic foresight projects with clients is we look at 5 or 6 different scenarios that on the surface seem very different. But as we start thinking about, okay, what do we have to do to thrive, not just survive in these different scenarios, we identify a set of characteristics, organizational or individual characteristics that keep coming up. And if we focus on those things, then we're very likely going to be developing capabilities and skills and that we're going to be able to, we're going to need in order to thrive in the future.
Yeah. So let's just riff on this for a minute. So if we were to kind of take the current paradigm, if you will, around population. So we need to keep producing more because we're pushing up on 9 billion. We got a couple billion to go before we fill this place up. I think that's a common belief. I mean, that's what I was taught as a kid and coming up and going through University of Minnesota and going through my FFA career. Like, hey, we got to be ready to feed 11 billion people, like potentially within our lifetime or by the end of the century. Okay. So let's overlay that with the advent of, let's say machine learning. I know that I would imagine like the advent of machine learning and AI now integrating into this space. So we can sprinkle that as a variable, right, into into that. We've got obviously labor, which we've talked about, which is going to be a big issue, and then let's say demand. Overall, likely I would assume increasing if population is going up. So if we were just to kind of like throw all that on the whiteboard and say, hey, let's riff on this. Let's do some strategic foresight on this. Like, can you walk me through like how would we intentionally do that? Because there's just so much like crap. When we look at putting that up there, it's like, well, how do we see through that? How do I make decisions? There could be so much confusion, but how would we start to leverage some of that stuff to start to use it?
Yeah, so I think a lot of it is about creating beginning to create a scenario that is coherent, right? And so it allows you to stretch your imagination a little bit. It doesn't have to be likely. You don't have to be personally attached to it. You're not making a prediction. You're just saying, okay,
here's a thing that could happen.
Yeah, if we're talking about is it 50%, is there a 50% chance this happens, or something like that. So we're not necessarily marrying ourselves to trying to say, well, this is what I think is going to happen, because if you have a personal attachment to that, then it really kind of narrows your ability to think through that. So if you think, okay, I think in the back of my mind, whether I want to admit this or not, this is what's going to happen in the next 10 years in terms of population trends, right? It becomes a whole lot harder to keep your mind open to these different scenarios. So if you're able to say, okay, we're just trying to create a coherent, plausible strategy or a plausible projection of what a scenario might look like. So we might say, okay, in 10 years, that's probably a little bit long for major population trends, but certainly in 10 years, we're going to be seeing certain regions of the country or certain regions of the world declining in population. We're already seeing that in Europe and Southeast Asia, and East Asia. And you're going to see in the next 10 years, another group of countries kind of tip over that edge, right? And so the international market and overall global demand is going to look a lot different, right? So we can start thinking about what that means. And so that means probably a shift in demand from East Asia and Europe to the Middle East and Africa. So well, what does that mean? What is that? We don't have any infrastructure as an industry in these certain areas. For the pork industry, obviously, if Northern Africa and the Middle East is one of the few remaining areas that still have very positive demographics, what does that mean for the fact that a majority of those people in Northern Africa and the Middle East are Muslim and don't consume our product? And so what does that mean for demand? And then you start thinking about labor availability and how that interacts with AI. And I think we've all gotten a big sort of eye-opener in the last even year or so, where we've always sort of thought about automation replacing blue-collar jobs, right? And we've really not seen that happen I think the pace that a lot of people expected. What we didn't expect was that some of these white collar jobs are very much being threatened by AI. And so how does that impact an agriculture business that is, certainly looking for help in making good decisions and things like that, but haven't quite gotten there in terms of automation, and so, does that sort of drive a trend to where we're seeing a group of young people that are more interested in working with their hands because that is an area that seems more protected from some of these AI type threats. And so maybe we have fewer people that are actually more interested in working with their hands. What does that mean for our industry, right? And so you can really have an interesting conversation around, okay, let's this scenario where there's fewer people, markets have changed, have shifted, and so we're having to try to source labor and source consumers from different parts of the world. So what does that mean if we're in the agriculture industry? And then this sort of maybe shift back towards more interest in people having physical jobs and working with their hands, younger people, could that potentially, benefit us? And how do we take advantage of that? So you start thinking through a scenario like that, and you build a multifaceted scenario and say, okay, well, if that happens, and we're not saying that it's going to happen, but if that comes to pass, what does that mean for our industry? What does that mean for our company specifically? What does it mean for me individually? Where am I going to be at? Where do I fit in that scenario? And I think that's a very productive conversation. And when you combine that with other scenarios where you take different combinations of those different variables and say, okay, well, maybe it's not quite that extreme. Maybe we have even fewer people than we thought we would. Maybe we have people available, but they're even more immigrants, and so here's a whole another scenario where we've got big cultural challenges, and how do we deal with those? And so there's different ways to structure those different scenarios, and as long as you're doing that in a structured way where you're evaluating these scenarios in the context of not necessarily how likely they are to happen, but if they were to happen, if that future was to come to pass, what does it mean? It's a very useful exercise in terms of going through multiple scenarios and then going back and saying, hey, look, here's a couple of similarities. Here's a couple of topics that kept coming up, right? I was taking notes and we looked at 4 really different scenarios, but this skill around being able to tap into non-traditional labor sources kept coming up. Maybe that's something we ought to really think about.
Okay. So it's all right. I just want to unpack that a little bit, right? Because I threw like 3 or 4 big things. Like, here's how do we feed 11 billion people? We've got machine learning and AI coming into this. We've got labor, issues in the picture. And so we just throw all that on a wall, and then we started sifting it backwards and like look at all, some different scenarios. And basically, this is like kind of like a science fair, right? Like, we're going to throw a hypothesis on the board and say, well, what if? What if population growth actually isn't what we've been told it's going to be for the last 40 years? Right.
Yeah. And so if you think about just the population issue, I think, I would certainly argue that the projections, the UN population division has been the gold standard. So when you hear about, the population of country X is going to be whatever in 2080, that's very likely that came from the UN projections, and specifically the medium variant of the UN projections. Right. And so there's a lot that can be said about, what the UN is actually saying and how that gets interpreted in the media. But I think there's a lot of people out there, I know there's a lot of people out there that think that the UN is off, and that the population globally is not going to peak in, I think their latest estimate was 2086, but that it's probably going to peak a lot closer to 2050. And that's the global population. And then we have key economies around the world where it already has tipped over. We lost 1 million people in China last year. Even the UN is projecting the current population of China is 1.45 billion, maybe. Not know exactly what to believe, but the projection for China's population, the UN projection for China's population in 2100 is 771 million. So they're, and I think they're underestimating that or overestimating what the population is going to
Sure.
be, underestimating the impact of some of these changes. But I mean, that's remarkable. I mean, you're talking about the
Mhm.
biggest country in the world losing half its population in the next 75 years. That may seem like a long time, but it's really, in the big scheme of things, it's not. And it's
Yeah.
not going to happen overnight. It's going to happen over time. And so you're
Yeah.
seeing a rapid aging in some of these key economies around the world. And if you look at it from an agriculture perspective, they represent a very big percentage of our export customer
Hmm.
base, right?
Hmm.
So
Yeah.
if you look at where most of our ag products go today, those populations are either declining or will be declining soon. And then when you look at the places that it's growing, and it's projected to continue to grow, at least natural population has
Hmm.
continued to grow. It's almost exclusively in Africa
Hmm.
and the Middle East, and we do very little in the way of, even in ag in general, we do very little
Right.
business with them. They represent, less than 10% of our total global exports. And so in the short and medium term, we're going to be seeing a shift in these markets. And in the long term, we're going to be seeing an overall reduction in food demand. And that's an
Mm.
environment that we're not prepared for. Well, in fact, we're not even prepared for thinking about what that looks like. And so, like you
Right.
mentioned, we have these assumptions that are baked into our systems, our strategies, our thought processes,
Hmm.
and we don't even realize they're baked in. And two of those are that the population is going to continue to increase. The global population is going to continue to increase. So it's going to be more and more mouths that we're going to have to feed. And then the second is that people are going to continually get richer, and that they're going to be able to, do a better job of meeting their needs, and eventually tip over where they can be, more concerned about what they eat and not that they eat, right?
Mm.
And so, and
Yeah.
those are two assumptions that have really driven uh, our, all the systems that we've built to feed, currently
Yeah.
8 billion people, and it's a remarkable accomplishment.
Yeah.
But those, at least one of those things is not going to be the case
Yeah.
in
Well,
the relatively near future.
and you just look at the United States, where we're still the wealthiest, richest place in the world, and you have a significant percentage of our own population that can't afford good, healthy food.
Right, right,
Right.
and
I mean,
so,
you have to eat
it's
stuff out of a box and eat, overly processed foods in order to, I mean, just afford to, just afford to live. I mean, I had a conversation with our, we've got a young adult child, the oldest of the six, and he's out there learning to adult, and yes, sat down to do some budgeting, right? Kind of work through a budget, and like, well, what do you think you need for food? And he's like, well, last couple of weeks I spent $55. And what are you eating? I can't look at a grocery store and not spend $55.
yeah,
Well, not healthy in anything, right? It's all in a box or frozen.
yep,
And so, it doesn't necessarily, to me, it doesn't, that little thing right there, that assumption that we've been making for a long time doesn't necessitate that people will eat better.
right,
Right.
right.
So,
Well, and then you can bring in, food wastage. I mean, I was speaking, and someone asked me, are you not worried about having to feed 11 billion people? And I said, "No, I'm really not. I'm not worried about it at all." And they said, "How could you say that?" And I said, "Well, first of all, I don't think there's ever going to be 11 billion people on the planet. I think
mhm.
we're going to peak at probably somewhere around 9 billion around mid-century. Uh, so, I don't think that's going to happen. But even if it does, I'm not terribly worried about it, because we produce more food every year, and we have for the last,
Yeah.
70 years produced about 2% more every year, and we already produce enough food to feed 11 billion people, right?
Mhm.
We waste a lot of it, and that's got to change. And we have poor distribution systems, so it doesn't always get to where it needs to be, and that needs to change as well. And then, I mean, we burn 10% of our global grain crop for fuel. Is that sustainable? Well, maybe it's sustainable, maybe it's not. But if it comes down to people starving to death, or us, creating ethanol, I think surely we can mobilize those calories for a better purpose. So,
Mhm.
I mean, I'm not concerned about that at all. I'm more concerned about the fact that we're going to have, more than enough food, and we don't have a way to think about what our food production systems need to look like in that environment. How do
Yeah.
we, it's always based on an assumption of scarcity. And if
Mhm.
that scarcity doesn't, exist anymore, then those systems start to fall apart. And so these are very basic, fundamental systems that we've relied on to, achieve, arguably the biggest achievement in human history. Feeding a population that exploded, and we've successfully met that demand, and so it's certainly something to be proud of, and that's part of the reason we have a hard time as an industry letting go of that, because it's something that we've really identified at. But like I've told people, in my speaking engagements around the world, there's no reason you have to quit being proud of what we've accomplished in order to realize that things are changing and we're going to have to make some adjustments.
Right.
We definitely should be proud. I'm certainly proud of my role in it. My small role in this huge accomplishment of epic proportions, but things are changing and we've got to figure out a way to adjust.
Yeah. Wow. So much to think about, man. And I would love to go deeper. I want to do one more little scenario because this popped up about 7 minutes ago and it hasn't left my mind, even with all the other talking we've done here. So let's just take a population like China as an example that all of a sudden we find out now is not necessarily, growing at the rate we thought it was. In fact, by 2050 or and certainly by the end of the century could be half of what it is today, right? So now it's all of a sudden going the other way. So to me, what that indicates is I should have an aging population, right? With fewer young people to be able to do some of the labor jobs that we spent the first half of the interview talking about, right? So what are some scenarios that equates to? Because now I'm looking at, well, you don't have the pop. I mean, how do you solve for an aging population where the top half of your population is the heaviest and the oldest, and do we even have enough labor to support the economy, defend the country, pay for the real estate, because that's their biggest economy in China, right? So yeah, I'm a little puzzled by that. Like that, to me, that doesn't speak to a great outcome.
Yeah, and it's and I'm not an economist, and so I try to be careful about making predictions about what's going to happen there. But if the economy in China is going to continue to grow at anywhere close to the rate that it has grown over the last 20 or 30 years, they're going to have to overcome a huge hurdle, and that is a population decline that's already begun to decline. It wasn't supposed to happen until about 2030, 2031. We found out last year, even the Chinese government statistics, they admitted it, which the fact that it happened didn't surprise me. The fact that they admitted it surprised me quite a bit.
Yeah, right.
And really nobody's projecting that it's going to come back, right? So it's like I've been telling people, even speaking to groups in China, I've been telling people, look, even if Chinese people started reproducing tomorrow at pre-industrial, rates, you're still talking about many decades before you see the impact of this. So, there is no scenario where you don't have a massive population decline in China, and perhaps more importantly, you have what is arguably the fastest aging population in human history, and that comes with huge ramifications. So there's a discussion right now going on in China about raising the retirement age. So the retirement or pension age for most white collar workers is 60. For some blue collar female workers, it can be as low as 50. And so you have people living, on average into their 80s, and so you're talking about, oh, wow, you got a 50-year-old woman that's going to live on a pension for 30 years. Maybe we could tap into that resource, right? Maybe we could get them to work longer. That's generally not popular when it happens. Probably it's going to have to happen, but it's generally not popular, and it creates an even more complicating situation in Asian cultures, because those are the people that are taking care of the kids now. So it's traditional for grandparents to play a primary role in caring for their grandchildren. And so if they don't have that resource available, so if mom and our grandma and grandpa are still working and they're not able to play a role in taking care of the kids, then that drives the fertility rate down even further and exacerbates the problem. So one of the challenges that we have with some of this population stuff is it's very hard to come up with a solution that doesn't also create as many problems as it solves. I mean, it's a really complicated situation, and I certainly don't have the answer, but I mean, there's not an economic system in the world that is designed to thrive in that sort of environment where the number of workers and, what they call productive people, from an
Yeah,
economic
right.
perspective, the percentage of productive people is at all-time lows, and we just don't have a model for what that looks like. And so we're flying in the dark. And you can look at Japan. Right now, my friend Daryl Bricker shared a while back with his subscribers. I think he shared that there's more adult diapers sold in Japan than there is baby diapers today.
Wow.
And so that tells you a lot about what's going on. But Japan went through that transition after they got rich, and they also went through that transition in a time when most of the rest of the world was still actively growing, and things were going pretty swimmingly, and they had pretty good connections to the rest of the world. And so some of the strategies that the Japanese have implemented are not going to be available for the Chinese and some of these other countries that are going through this transition. So it's definitely going to be a huge paradigm shift. And it's very concerning to me that there's not, you're starting to see some momentum. Some of us have been out here talking about this issue for several years now. It's starting to gain some momentum. I'm certainly happy to see that, but we desperately need to begin a dialogue as an industry. And it's not just agriculture. I think agriculture is a great example of an industry that's going to be impacted here in a very unique way, but it's going to touch every corner of the economy. And, like I said, we don't have a system. China's economic system, very different than ours, obviously, but it still relies on the same basic premise that the older workers or older retirees are going to be supported by younger workers. And when there's fewer and fewer younger workers and more older retirees, that becomes an unsustainable system very quickly.
Yeah. Well, it's such a fascinating time, and thank you for diving into that last one for me to just really give people a snapshot of, hey, here's something that could be happening, right? Even it's plausible, even if it's not even if not perfect from this is exactly how it plays out. It's not a prediction, it's not a prophecy, but it is a plausible scenario that we might be ending up in. And so from an intentional leadership perspective, right? I'm at the age now where we're starting to transition from kids to like, hey, maybe in 5-10 years we might have grandkids. And you start to see your lineage really start to expand almost exponentially, right? So what am I leaving behind for that next generation? To me, that's what an intentional leader ought to be thinking about. Like, as leaders in this space, and especially in agriculture, the most important industry that there is, like, it's when everything else, if the lights go off and everything else goes away, like, you still got to eat. And so, like, this is a space that we need to be thinking about, like, well, what are we leaving behind for future generations? And I'm not talking about just leaving the farm behind. That affects way less than 1% of Americans, right? So what are we leaving behind in terms of food and food production, and what's the legacy, right, of this space look like? And it's a fascinating conversation, and maybe sometime we'll have to jump on and when we learn more or have other ways to look, other lenses to look at this through, jump on and talk some more about it. But this has been fascinating to me. I did not follow my normal script that I do with all the other interviewees, because I'm like, I get Todd's brain here for a minute. I want to give people a different experience and just like give them the like, hey, you got to have a mechanism in your life, in your world, within your leadership team, in your arsenal to use some strategic foresight and start thinking outward. And we can do this on macro stuff, geopolitical stuff like this. And you can also take that all the way down to your personal life, right? What's your mechanism? 30 minutes over coffee and the Bible in the morning to have some strategic foresight for my day. It's the same thing.
Yep.
So,
well, and I think the intentional kind of framework applying to that, I think, is really important, because I have a tendency to spend too much time in that world, right, and not enough time in the present, right? That's my natural inclination. And so that's not productive either, right? You have to live your life, and you have to so I have to be more intentional about making sure that I'm, living in the moment and meeting my current responsibilities, and don't spend too much time with my head in the clouds trying to think about what's going to happen in the future. But certainly, I think that's the opposite is a much bigger issue for a lot of people, especially in our industry, but I think in general is, and I understand some of the hesitancy. I mean, the idea that you're going to, if you take that short-term business planning mentality and say, okay, well, we're trying to project with some reasonable accuracy what our revenue is going to be over the next 12 months and what our cost of production is going to be over the next 12 months. Well, that's not entirely unreasonable, right? But if that's what you're trying to do and trying to project what's my revenue going to be in 2033 and what's my cost of production going to be in 2033, I'm not sure that's even a productive exercise, because there's so many different variables there. You can't predict the future. And so what I'm trying to encourage people with the strategic foresight framework is there's a way to productively live in the future and think about the future in a way that doesn't require you to predict the future. I mean, there's an expression in strategic foresight that that we're not trying to predict the future, we're at least not accurately, right? So and then the other one that I really like is that we're not trying to predict the future, we're trying to predict the futures, right? And understand what those different scenarios might look like. And to me, that's a productive way to put yourself in the future and and build out scenarios where you're saying, even some of the projections that I do on population, I'm saying, okay, well, you don't have to agree that this is what's going to happen. This is what we think is a likely scenario. So it's certainly plausible. And what does that mean, right? And so we can look at even different scenarios there. You mentioned, earlier, maybe we're not right about that. One of the things that almost nobody disagrees with is that the global population is going to peak at some time in the next, 75 years and begin declining. So that discussion about what happens when that happens is really more of a matter of, is it going to happen in 20 years or is it going to happen in 50 years? It's not a matter of if, it's when and to what degree, right? And so if we're thinking about scenarios, I mean, it's hard to imagine a scenario where the global population doesn't peak sometime in the next 75 years and begin declining, right? And so we can be pretty confident that that's going to happen. And so then we're just talking about the degrees and the time frames, and certainly that can make a big difference. But eventually that's going to happen. Eventually we're going to have to develop some systems for that scenario, and I see very little disadvantage in spending some time trying to think about what those could look like.
Yeah. Wow. Well, it's such a fascinating world that you live in, and I guess if we can't have the Stargate, then we have to leverage strategic foresight.
Yeah, for sure.
All right. So Todd, how do we hook people up with you? How do we get in touch? What's the best way to reach out?
So I'm pretty active on LinkedIn. I have a personal website where really kind of focused on some of my speaking and writing around strategic foresight and bigger agriculture. That's toddthurman.me. So TODDTHURMAN.me. And then the company's website is swineinsights.com. And so you can find more information about me than you probably ever wanted to know, and link to my personal website from there, and find out what we do in terms of our consulting and training business.
Fantastic. All right, man. Thanks for being on with us today.
You bet. Thanks for having me.